Welcome to this episode of the People Dividend Podcast. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that challenges conventional wisdom about how to measure success in organizations. Our guest is here today to show us why goals and targets might be doing more harm than good and what we can do instead. So, our guest today is Radhika Dutt, an entrepreneur, speaker, and author of the groundbreaking book, Radical Product Thinking, the new mindset for innovating smarter, which has been translated into Chinese and Japanese, and the methodologies in it are used in over 40 countries. Radhika has built products across industries, from robotics to wine, and currently is working on a second book, which we'll talk about. So she's here today to share her insights on how we can rethink metrics, goals, and performance to create meaningful change. Radhika, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I'm excited to be here.
Hey, that's great. Let's talk about your first book and what you're working on today. If you were to describe the first book in a sentence or two, and then talk about the transition, what's led to this upcoming work that you have in progress?
Yeah. So the burning question that led me to the first book was there are so many product diseases that I kept running across, just diseases that we catch when building products and that are often fatal to products. And the question was, are we all just doomed to learning from hard lessons, or is there a systematic process that we can have to build world-changing products? And that was the question that I was able to answer with radical product thinking. It's a methodology for helping organizations build world-changing products while avoiding those common product diseases like pivotitis, obsessive sales disorder, strategic swelling, and so on. And what led me to the second book that I'm working on is a lot of people who read Radical Product Thinking said, I love this long-term and systematic approach, but in my company, what I'm driven towards is the short-term stuff because I'm driven by goals and OKRs. I have to hit those numbers or show those numbers. So how do I take this approach in an organization that's so goal-driven? And I was starting to see all the side effects of goals and OKRs, which I had seen for a long time in my career. And this book is to articulate those side effects, those negative side effects of goals and OKRs. And it helps people take a very different approach instead that actually drives better business results.
Why talk a little bit about for our audience, for members in our audience who aren't familiar with what an OKR is or what a KPI is. Could you explain that and why they are so familiar in the lexicon of business?
Yeah. So OKRs stand for objectives and key results. And so if you're lucky enough to not be familiar with them, that's fantastic because it often seems like it's a new idea and just revolutionary because John Doerr, the famous billionaire VC, wrote about it in his book, Measure What Matters in 2018. And Larry Page from Google said, oh, this is Google's secret to success. Whereas, in reality, when I talk to a lot of Googlers, they anonymously say, well, it seems like I think we actually evangelize OKRs just to kill our competition. OKRs, KPIs, they're all methodologies for goal setting, and they tell you what are good ways, supposedly, of setting targets. And the idea is to set aspirational targets, things that you're not supposed to hit.
When you look at these goal setting systems, why do you think these systems backfire at times? And what was the inspiration for writing about these backfires or this topic?
Yeah. So one thing that I find is when you set a target, the incentive that you create for employees is, as an employee, I then want to show you that we've hit that target, right? So when you set a target, my desire is to please you and to show you that we've hit that target, achieve those numbers. So what happens? Even subconsciously, if it's not malicious, right? You tend to want to look for the positive indicators that show you, look, ta-da, I've made progress. I've hit the number that you wanted. And what happens subconsciously is that we're not looking at the bad numbers. We're sort of sweeping those under the rug. And what happens so as a leader, you're seeing the good news and you've seen people hit those numbers. They want to show you progress. What you really want to see as a leader is the reality from the trenches. You want your employees to look at those bad numbers and then just think about it like a puzzle. You want them to look at those bad numbers, play detective and say, I wonder what's going on. Is that an opportunity? Is that a problem? You want them to dig into the bad. Right. And so that's the key problem with goals and OKRs.
You've said too, at least as I understand, that some of these measurement systems really hit passionate employees the hardest. And can you share an example of how this happens and why it's so damaging?
Yeah. And that's such an important point about how it hits your highest performing employees the hardest. Because what happens with goals and targets, OKRs, is it creates performance theater. And I'm going to give you the example that actually, a host on a podcast was sharing. He was saying how he worked at Microsoft and he was working in the customer service team. And their target was to minimize the amount of time it takes to close a call. So what was the performance theater created? There was one woman who was in the team who would keep track of the queue and she would look at which are the easiest calls to close. And she would jump on those calls and put those in her queue, right? And so her numbers looked fantastic. But if you look at who was actually solving the hardest questions, who had the knowledge, it was everyone else who was taking much longer to solve those problems, right? And so this is the performance theater. Like everyone was feeling so demotivated because she was getting rewarded for picking out the easiest problems and putting it in her queue. So this is the kind of performance theater that happens, right? You see this in sales as well. I've seen salespeople really demotivated when they are good about, following the rules, not taking on custom features, whereas some of their colleagues will hit numbers, they'll take on custom features, throw in discounts, do whatever they need to, right? But then in having to participate in this performance theater or watching others succeed from this performance theater, whereas you want to do good quality work because you care about it, that is the huge hit on high performance, on the true high performers, right? And it's soul sucking for them.
I think this is Dutt's law, and correct me if I'm wrong or if I have it wrong. But Dutt's law is that metrics drive progress when they're tools for insight, not yardsticks for evaluation. Do I have that right? Is that it?
Exactly. And by the way, I think there's a special place in hell for people who name laws after themselves. So why did I write up Dutt's law? And the answer to that is, what I'm saying about these ill effects of goals and targets. We've actually known some of these ill effects and we could have predicted them because there are laws of metrics that have existed for half a century. There's Goodhart's law, which comes from economics. A famous British economist said, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Then there's Campbell's law from anthropology. And he said, the more a measure is used for evaluation, the more likely it is to be gamed and therefore is no longer a good measure of evaluation. Right? So we've known from economics and anthropology for 50 years, this was from 1975 and 76, we've known for so long that there are such ill effects of setting targets and using metrics for evaluation. We see this in teachers being measured by schools' test results, right? Or students' test results or scores. And then you see teaching to the test. So we've known this for a long time. And so that's why I felt like I needed to put together Dutt's law to explain not just what doesn't work, but to show what does work instead.
And if we don't have though goals and targets, how do we measure performance? I mean, don't we need metrics to identify low performers and reward high performers?
So true. But let's talk first about the solution and what do you do instead? And then we can talk about how does that work for evaluation, right? So what I propose instead of goals and targets, and I've been using this with companies and driven much better business results by using this, is instead of goals and targets, this mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving. So let me share an example of how this would work, right? So let's use the example of sales because we've known, or known in quote unquote, we've just always believed that to do sales right, you need targets. So how do you set a puzzle? The way of setting a puzzle might be you describe a problem. Our market expects us to hit X million revenues by the end of the year, but I see a problem with this. Sales have grown in the last 3 years, but say in the last year, they've plateaued a bit. So then I might have questions, things I genuinely don't know answers for. For example, maybe it's that our competitors have done something that, we've really fallen behind on. Maybe it's that in terms of sales, our messaging was resonating with the early adopters, but we haven't figured out how to sell to the mass market. Or perhaps it's that our product really met the needs of those early adopters. And we haven't figured out how to meet the needs of this mass market. And so we ask some of these questions that we genuinely don't know the answers to. And then we define the puzzle in the objective. So the objective is basically summarizing all of this to say, to get back to our growth trajectory by solving this puzzle. So that's setting the puzzle. Now let me share what it means to actually solve this puzzle, right? So again, using the sales example, let's say that you're trying to figure out, maybe we knew how to message to the early adopters. And so there are 3 questions in this puzzle solving approach. The first question is, how well did it work? Right? It's not binary of did you or didn't you hit the target. It's how well did it work, so that I'm really inviting the good and the bad. So in this case, maybe, we tried out sales messaging, and now, we're starting to get meetings with those with the mass market people, right? And so maybe the messaging is starting to work. So that's great. So it seems to work. That's the answer to how well is it working. What have we learned? That's the second question. So the first one was, how well is it working? Second is, what have we learned? And so what have we learned? We look at data and say, what can we tell from this? So in this case, it's maybe that, okay, great. Now I'm getting those meetings with the decision makers with this new messaging. But you know what? It turns out that there's this other group within the mass market organizations that we're not reaching, that they have to buy in. So the decision makers, we've learned from them that you also have to sell to this group. So now that's what we learned. So what will we try next? That's the last question. What will we try next? And that might be, okay, now I'm going to try webinars to this other group that we haven't been targeting traditionally. Maybe I'm going to create stuff that's easy for this decision maker to forward to others, right? So this is maybe what I try next. So this is how we go about solving the puzzle.
I'm also interested in eventually moving into this, conversation about objectives, hypothesis, and learning. I mean, it all seems so related to this whole concept of evaluation and understanding performance in a newer context.
Exactly. You're so right. So this methodology of puzzle setting and puzzle solving, I call it OHLs, or objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. But if I just were to call it objectives, hypotheses, learnings, it just sounds really dry. Whereas when I talk about it as puzzle setting and puzzle solving, I found that it really resonates with teams, right? Like there's excitement about solving puzzles. There isn't excitement about objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. But in fact, what you heard me in describing in the sales example was exactly, there was a hypothesis. If we try this new sales message, right, maybe this will work better. And then there were learnings, and it's all scaffolding around that. And so to go back to the evaluation question, right, one of the things I see often is we are so intent in organizations in terms of just constantly putting numbers to performance. I want to rate you as a 5 or a 4 as an employee. But why do we want to do that? When we ask the why question, often it's because the answer is, well, if we are ever doing layoffs, I want to know who's a 3 versus a 5, and I would lay off, the 3s, right? But one thing I've realized is that's not necessarily the best way of constantly making someone feel evaluated. Yes, you do want to grow their performance, right? Not just evaluate them. If I tell you that you're a 3 versus you're a 5, what have you learned? Like, not really much, right? And if you think about just performance, the one-on-ones, those performance evaluation one-on-ones, there's always defensiveness because, people are always worried. Are you going to rate me 3 or 5? I want to justify what I did, right? And so instead, let's take that off the table. I am evaluating people, but the way I do it is by looking at their answers to how well is it working? What have I learned? What will I try next? Because when I hear what have we learned and what will I try next? I know how deeply they're actually thinking about the problem. Like I can get a true sense for, how deeply have you thought about this? How deep is your analysis? I can ask just 1 or 2 questions and then, give instant feedback. This is how I develop performance as opposed to constantly just judging, right? And so what I find is rather than this focus on evaluation, we can really focus on harnessing performance from every single individual. And this approach of how well did it work? What have we learned? And what will we try next? Gives you scaffolding for how do you harness performance from everyone.
That's great. I mean, are there examples of teams or organizations that are adopting this puzzle solving or OHL approach and where they've seen transformation?
Yeah, I've been super excited to see the results. So there's an organization I've been working with in the maritime industry. And by the way, of all industries I've worked in, maritime is by far the most complicated. And what was interesting was when I joined this company as a consultant about 2 years ago, so in 2023, they had been using OKRs or target KPIs, etc. But they were using the OKR methodology, and they either hit or didn't hit OKRs, but it wasn't fundamentally changing the results, right? Their market growth had stalled at the time. Their usage had stalled at the time when I joined. And when I came in, we started to talk about it like a puzzle. We hadn't figured out the market, like what wasn't working. Why were only our product was amazing. We had the most amazing data accuracy that could match which vessels match which cargoes. So that's what the company did, right? So matching vessels, shipping vessels to cargoes so that you could make the most profits. And yet, like if we had the best data, why wasn't everyone using it? And the puzzle that we figured out was our data felt like magic to a lot of people. And people who are not tech savvy, they don't like magic, it turns out. Like they like feeling in control. They don't like this feeling of, you're spitting out numbers. I have no idea where this came from. And they wanted control. And yet, if you give them too much control where they feel like, now you're just overwhelming me with all this information, right? It's just becoming scary. So how do you solve this puzzle where if you give too much information, you're scaring someone? If you give them too little, it feels like magic. So that was the puzzle. And so we started using this approach of how well is it working? What have we learned? What are we going to do next? We would try things in the span of, even just customer interviews, trying things with one customer, moving to the next conversation, using those learnings and trying a different design, etc. And so by the end of 2 years, here's what we found. From stalled growth in 2023, we doubled growth in 2024 and then again doubled in 2025. And we reduced customer churn from 26% to 4%, right? And so this is why I felt like I had to write about this, because this produced much better results by puzzle setting and puzzle solving than we ever saw with OKRs.
Wow, that's amazing. It's great to hear the experience and the observation of this transformation. Perhaps as a last question before we begin to wrap up and with some other types of questions is for leaders who want to introduce OHLs into their organization, what's the first step they should take?
Such a great question. So one of the biggest challenges for a leader, and here's where I empathize with leaders, is with OKRs, you feel like this is the devil I know. And one of the concerns is, does my team know how to measure, to be rigorous about measurement, about puzzle solving, right? And that's scary for leaders to jump into doing this puzzle setting and puzzle solving with OHLs. And so here's what I would suggest. As a leader, you can try this out, right? Use the OHL's approach. Take an initiative that you've worked on and you can role model for your team this approach of how well did it work? What have I learned? What will I try next? And it helps your team start to build this mindset. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, as you introduce this to your team, you can use this to figure out, how deep is their thinking, right? You can help build that muscle through one-on-ones. And as you see that you're getting them to be comfortable, that you're seeing the kind of depth of thinking that you need, right, for this puzzle setting and puzzle solving, then you can start to use this more ubiquitously. And so this is how we approached it at this maritime company, Signal. We introduced it to the team. As the team got comfortable, we started using it in our monthly business reviews. We started presenting features in terms of here's how well it worked. What have we learned? What will we try next? And it generated much better, deeper, insightful conversations so that we talked about the good and the bad. And it sort of created this collaborative environment in the company where we were all talking about problems and how are we going to attack it from different angles, from sales, marketing, product, etc. So that's how you can approach it as a leader.
Oh, that's great. It's great to see all the dynamic teamwork and team effort that goes into that. It's been absolutely delightful to have Radhika Dutt, you as a guest today on the show. And you're really challenging us to rethink how we measure success in organizations. So it's been very helpful. Where can our listeners learn more about your work if they want to connect with you?
Great. So you can get the Radical Product Thinking book. It's on bookstores, it's on Amazon. You can also download the free OHL's toolkit. So you can go to radicalproduct.com and I can share the link under toolkits. You'll see the OHL's toolkit and you can download it and start to use it right away. And I'm working on the second book about why goals and OKRs don't work and what actually does. So I'm working on telling all of these stories. So as you use OHLs, you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I can share a link to my profile too. So people are welcome to reach out to me and share their experiences. And if you do, it might just make it into the book as a case study.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Radhika Dutt. It's been great having you on the People Dividend podcast. You have a unique background across so many industries, and I'm so glad to have your thought leadership in this area of measurement and success in organizations. Thank you once again.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
And until the next episode of the People Dividend podcast, I encourage all of my listeners to stay well. But, be sure if you're a new listener, subscribe, leave a review, and tune in for the next podcast. Until then, stay well.